Welcome everyone to our spring webinar series, The Long Civil Rights Movement. For those of you tuning in today for the first time, I'm Dave Johnson. I'm currently serving as past president of MCSS, and I'm also the Online Learning Committee chair. I'm very excited for tonight's programming. It is part 2 of a 4-part series. And if you've registered just for one, you should consider heading to the MCSS website and registering for the remaining parts as well. As many of you know, the events stemming from the summer of 2020, most particularly the murder of George Floyd, resulted in one of the first organizational statements that the Michigan Council for Social Studies has put out in many, many years. We promised to use our collaborative voice to make positive changes in education and our local communities. And tonight's session is just another step down this pathway. The first 3 sessions, this one's number 2, will be guided by Dr. Michael Butler from Flagler College. I'll introduce him in just a moment, but first, a couple of quick housekeeping things. Like I mentioned on Monday, there's a lot going on this particular slide, but there's a lot going on with the Michigan Council for Social Studies. MCSS is a nonprofit organization staffed entirely by volunteers. Our tagline isn't a mission or a vision, but rather a snapshot of what we believe. And it's that tomorrow's leaders are currently learning today, and the teachers across this great state are the ones preparing them for the future. Whether you're a current member or not, we hope you'll consider joining or renewing your membership with us as we seek to partner with and support you in this important endeavor. For $40 a year, members gain access to special webinar recaps like this one. You receive the MCSS Toolbox, a publication just for members that contains tips and strategies for teaching social studies. We run an annual Olympiad for students, which is an amazing opportunity to showcase the great things your students are doing in your classroom. You'll receive 2 issues of the Great Lakes Social Studies Journal each year. It's a new peer-reviewed journal that contains articles with both theory and practice. You'll receive a discounted rate to our annual conference, currently slated to be back in person next year in beautiful Traverse City, Michigan, the middle of April. You'll be able to be a part of additional training opportunities like the one we just wrapped up with the Library of Congress, Teaching with Primary Sources. And then finally, your membership provides advocacy. And on the slide, we've got a picture of former President Annie Whitlock at the Capitol, meeting with legislators about the important work you guys do in the classroom. We are a thriving organization, and it's because of support from members like you, and we hope you'll consider joining or renewing today. So with that out of the way, let's get down to the real reason you guys are here tonight. Dr. Michael Butler is a Keenan Distinguished Professor of History at Flagler College. He's taught there since 2008. His work has appeared in many leading peer-reviewed academic publications, such as the Journal of American Studies, the Journal of Southern History, the Florida Historical Quarterly, and Southern Cultures. His book, Beyond Integration, The Black Freedom Struggle in Escambia County, Florida, 1960 through 1980, won a 2017 Florida Book Award in nonfiction. Dr. Butler specializes in Southern cultural history with an emphasis on the civil rights movement, and he teaches a number of classes on the topic and has served as the lead scholar in multiple teacher training seminars related to the civil rights movement. His current project is an examination of Black popular cultural production between 1965 and 1980. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Butler. Welcome back, first of all, and thanks for being here with us again.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thanks to everyone for returning. I didn't know that I was the reason that they're all here, Dave. I thought it was maybe we established in the last meeting that it was because they're trying to avoid grading. But you know, hey, I'll take any compliment that I can get, right? I think the real reason that you're here is to see how I put the master narrative of the civil rights movement into 60 minutes or less, because quite honestly, I'm wondering how I'm going to do that too. So this is going to be a fun exercise because we, in the last session, picked certain topics that I think we can introduce to students through which we can give the idea of how the civil rights movement kind of defies the chronology that it is typically given. In other words, we're going to talk about the master narrative today and what that means. But the first set of topics were meant to reinforce that freedom is a long struggle. It's a constant struggle. Yet at the same time, we have to frame it for what the movement was rebelling against, what it wanted change, and the way that it went about seeking change. And what we established was the purpose of the change was discriminatory laws. How do we combat? How do we reverse? How do we confront and challenge legalized segregation? Now, it wasn't just the segregation in places of public accommodation, it was that. But it was also voting disenfranchisement, which, as I said in the last session, really didn't pertain to Jim Crow, but we'll talk a little more about that, particularly in the third installment of the trilogy that is being presented here. But when historians talk about the master narrative, okay, what we talk about is what I call the greatest hits of the civil rights movement. 1954, for the purposes of this lecture, we're going to go for a decade. From 54 to 64. From Brown, the influential, important Brown versus Topeka Board of Education decision, to passage of the Civil Rights Act. This is where the quintessential American freedom struggle happens, okay? And our challenge, I think, or my challenge as a teacher of this information, is to not just give the main points, to introduce the figures that we're all familiar with or have heard of, but also to answer the all-important so what question. Because as the name implies, it's a narrative. It's a narrative. What is the narrative? How does it progress? Who are the main characters and what do they contribute to the movement? So sometimes my students call this the debunking accepted myths about the civil rights movement, because I think there's a little bit of that too, history mythbusters. But this decade is what historians call the master narrative, the most important events in this struggle against legalized segregation. And again, keep those words in mind as we go. So if we had to begin somewhere with the master narrative, and we left off last class, or last presentation, I consider it a class, with the Second World War and the Double V. We see that there are key individuals who are World War I veterans who pledged themselves to defeat Hitler abroad and continue the fight against Jim Crow at home. We have that occur. And one of the ways that it occurs is through the legal system. The NAACP, by the 1950s, had developed a legal defense fund. In other words, they had a section dedicated to challenging segregated schools in the courtrooms, right? It's a change in strategy because for a long time, school segregation was addressed on a local case-by-case issue. And it was really the brainchild of the head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, a man by the name of Thurgood Marshall. It was really his idea to take a variety of different school integration suits, combine them, and file suit against them in federal court. The idea was we would make it all the way to the Supreme Court, right? And the lead case was the school board of Topeka, Kansas. This is all going to lead us to the highly important May 17, 1954, unanimous 8-0 Brown versus Topeka Board of Education decision. Of course, the majority opinion proclaimed that in the field of education, separate but equal has no place. Separate is inherently unequal. In other words, it's a contradiction. Although it doesn't directly overturn Plessy, in spirit, it is the first major judicial blow against segregation in the South. Now, it's a really interesting case as you boil it down. It's 5 separate school integration cases put into one. And the reason that Topeka, Kansas was the lead case was because it was the place where segregation was, if we had to say operating most ideally for Blacks, it's Topeka, Kansas. For instance, it's only elementary schools that were segregated. Segregated schools were well funded. The arguments that Southerners made for the maintenance of segregated schools, in other words, don't hold water with Topeka, Kansas. See, the NAACP attacked segregation not on the facilities, right? Yeah, it's bad. The state of South Carolina would spend in the 1940s $73 per white student on public schools and approximately 12 on African-American schools. But the NAACP was really, really smart in saying that we want to attack segregation not on the discrepancy in money spent, separate but equal. If you're not equal, then you can spend money and catch up and be separate and equal and thus maintain the law, right? What the NAACP did, which establishes the foundation legally in the struggle against segregated facilities, is that segregation deprives the student of their 14th Amendment right to equal protection under the law. That's a huge, huge difference. That's a switch. That's a change. Not that separate but equal is not being maintained because separate is not equal. It's that separate but equal has no place under the 14th Amendment. That's really important. And that establishes the legal framework, right? Now, Roy Wilkins, the president of the NAACP, called the Brown verdict a second Emancipation Proclamation. They knew during this period that Brown, the Supreme Court decision, was a game changer. However, there were limitations, okay? There were limitations to the Brown verdict. The first, time frame. When did schools in the South have to integrate? They didn't say. A year later, an amendment to the Brown verdict was passed. It was called, cleverly enough, Brown 2. And Brown 2 ruled that Southern districts had to integrate with, quote, all deliberate speed. All deliberate speed. Well, what did that mean? There's one legislator in Mississippi that said, we've had 300 years of enslavement. It's going to take at least 300 years for our schools to integrate, right? So all deliberate speed was an issue. The second limitation of Brown, even though it is monumental, right? We also have to point out the realities. Time frame was all deliberate speed. Enforcement was left unanswered. What happens if a school district resists? What happens if a state or a county delays, stonewalls, or just refuses to integrate? What, is the president going to send in federal troops to make sure that students are given access to classrooms? It was unspoken, it was unknown, right? Now, one of the things that happens with Brown, and this is contested, some scholars say that Brown sparked a backlash. In other words, white resistance is really going to peak now. There are Southerners who believe that this is the first step to what they called racial amalgamation. Today, we call it the Great Replacement theory, right? This idea that somehow, if you let Black kids into the classroom, and this was literally language that was used, they're next going to want to integrate the bedrooms. So, is there a white response? Is there a backlash? There absolutely is. But Brown is seen as, within this master narrative, as the first major watershed event in the traditional civil rights movement. After 54, events start to escalate rapidly. Almost every year, there's a major event in America's struggle for racial equality. The next year, August 28th, 1955, the murder of Emmett Till. Now, Emmett Till is really, really powerful as a story, as a narrative that you can share with your students, because if they are high school history students, they're not far from this age in either direction. Emmett Till was 14 years old. Emmett Till was born and reared in Chicago. Great Migration, right? We talked about that. Most of his relatives remained in Mississippi. Emmett Till was set to spend the summer of 1955 with relatives in a place named Sumter County. Now, his mother, Mamie Till Mobley, understood that in the South things were different, and she tried to explain to Emmett what it was like and how he had to behave, but Emmett was a typical rambunctious 14-year-old resident from Chicago who's going to come South and brag, show off to his backward Mississippi kinfolk of what life's like in the big city, right? He ends up in a local store, Bryant's Market, where something happens on the way out. Now, we know that she lied about it because she has since claimed to have lied about it, but the owner's wife, Carolyn Bryant, was behind the counter, and she claimed that Emmett, on the way out, grabbed her hand, said, "Don't worry, I've been with white women before," and asked her for a date. His cousin said he whistled coming out of the store. His mother said, and Emmett did have a stuttering issue, that she told him when he got caught up on a word to always whistle it out to clear your palate. She died with the belief that Emmett was trying to say goodbye, got stuck and whistled. Whatever the case may be, right? When her husband and brother-in-law returned, she told them what happened. They went to the place where they knew Emmett Till was staying, and August 28, 1955 was the last time anyone saw Emmett Till alive. When he was discovered, it was submerged in a local river with a 75-pound cotton engine fan tied around his neck with barbed wire. He had been shot in the head. He had been murdered. Now, this could be another story of a Black person, even a young Black person, disappearing, ending up dead, and nothing being done about it. That was unfortunately a way of life in Mississippi in the 1950s. But when his corpse was brought back to the North, his mother made a decision that had international ramifications. Mamie Till decided to let the world see what they did to my boy. She had an open casket funeral, and the images are shocking. It made the front page of Jet magazine. When his murderers were arrested and put on trial, it took the jury, all white men, whose average age, I swear, if you look at the picture of the jury, had to have been 78. It took them all of 54 minutes to return a not guilty verdict against the two men for killing Emmett Till, with the jury foreman saying it wouldn't have taken that long, but we walked across the street to have a Coke. A 14-year-old boy murdered in cold blood in Mississippi. The two men who did this to Till, because our laws of double jeopardy, right? You can't be tried twice for the same crime, admitted to a journalist that they, quote, had no choice but to kill Emmett Till, because when a colored boy thinks he's the equal to a white man, he's tired of living. That's an exact quote. The Emmett Till case reinforced the violence, the brutality, the legacy of lynching that I've discussed in the last seminar continued into the 1950s in places like Mississippi. And there are very few memoirs that you can read pertaining to the 60s civil rights movement where people don't mention Emmett Till by name. The image of him in the coffin, the idea that his murderers openly confess and are not punished for killing him, lasts with teenagers as they become young adults, and it catalyzes the struggle for racial change in America. In fact, before she stepped on the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks said that she was nervous, but one of the things that gave her strength was thinking about Emmett Till. Rosa Parks, as we know, this is part of the traditional civil rights narrative, right? You know, I often say that Rosa Parks freed the slaves. Martin Luther King was elected president of Black America. He walked so Obama can run, and then racism's gone forever, right? That's kind of the narrative. You've got Rosa Parks, Dr. King, and President Obama that are often mentioned all together. And that is such an oversimplification of the American struggle. I joke about it, but there's some truth in the simplicity with which we often view these things. For instance, Rosa Parks, you know the narrative. Your students know the narrative. A lady who was sick and tired of being sick and tired. One day she is so tired on the bus in Montgomery, she's asked to get up and she can't. She doesn't. That totally ignores the fact that Rosa Parks was a lifelong civil rights activist in Alabama, whose job for the NAACP prior to her moving to Montgomery was to investigate sex crimes perpetuated by white men against Black women. She was not a little old lady who was sick and tired of being sick and tired. She was 32 years old to begin with. She represented an entire people and was almost a default heroine of the movement. Now, what I mean by that is that in Montgomery, because of everything that was happening in the nation, because of Brown, because of Emmett Till, African Americans in Montgomery began asking themselves what African Americans around the South began to ask themselves during this time. And that is, what can we do here to bring change? What can we do in Montgomery, Alabama to bring change? What can we do in Montgomery to prevent our boys and girls from being slaughtered like Emmett Till? And what they identified was the fact that the schools were problematic, but the place where African Americans encountered daily reminders of their second-class citizenship was when they rode the city-owned bus lines. You see, the buses were the primary way that Black workers got from place to place, went to their jobs, came home that day, went to town to do shopping, whatever the case may be. Vehicle ownership is not that widespread. And 80% of the Montgomery bus customers were, in fact, Black. The drivers of the buses were all white men, and they had police power. They were deputized. And these men had incredibly poor reputations as brutal, dehumanizing, nasty people. African Americans on the buses had to pay at the front, and they had to go around to the back door to get in. And they had to fill from the back up, right? They had to fill the bus from the back up. So there is no Black and white sitting area. It was really based on who was on the bus and where white people wanted to sit, right? The boundary was movable. So if a white person got on the bus and they saw an African American sitting on the 4th seat and they want to sit on the 5th seat, then guess what? They sat on the 5th seat and everybody else had to move behind them. It was the drivers who enforced the racial status quo, and they were notoriously brutal, particularly when it came to dealing with Black women. So there were people who said the buses are a problem. An organization called the Montgomery Improvement Association formed. And one of their main objectives was to equalize seating on these public accommodations. Well, there were 2 volunteers who would symbolically be arrested. The idea that the Montgomery Improvement Association came up with was that we will have an arrest and we will send a message economically. We will boycott the city buses for the day. Okay. First 2 people who were considered for the symbolic arrest that would start the Montgomery bus boycott, they had problematic features in their backgrounds, right? Rosa Parks didn't. Rosa Parks was actually the secretary of the Montgomery Improvement Association. Rosa Parks had a sterling reputation both in the Black and white community because she worked as a seamstress in a white downtown department store. Church-going, her husband owned his own business, economically self-sufficient, that mattered. So Rosa Parks was the person that the Montgomery Improvement Association agreed to let be arrested to start this boycott, okay? So there's a little bit of truth in the, well, we didn't know Rosa Parks was going to be arrested. The plan was worked out. They didn't know exactly what day the arrest would take place. And it was on December 1st, 1955. December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks picked her driver. She wanted to board the bus of the person that was most brutal and most disrespectful to the Black population. And when she was told, you've got to move, all she said to the man was, why is it that you treat us like you do? She was arrested, processed, and the Montgomery Improvement Association started a bus boycott that lasted for over a year. Now, bus boycott, big deal. Why is this important? Well, one of the reasons that it's important is because it demonstrates that a Black community is mobilizing to improve local circumstances. And again, if there's something that I stress at this point, it's that the civil rights movement is always sparked by local people who identify injustice and take steps to right that injustice. Okay. We never would have heard of Rosa Parks if not for the bus boycott and for what happened. She was not even a local celebrity, right? She was known in her community, but it was events that made Rosa Parks who she becomes known as. The other person that emerges as a national figure during this time is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He's not a doctor yet, right? But this is a great story to tell because it demonstrates that a man doesn't make the movement makes the man. Historical forces sometimes are bigger than individuals. And I say that about Martin Luther King because Martin Luther King had been in Montgomery for less than a year. Martin Luther King had landed a sweet job as the minister at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Dexter Avenue was a church for the middle and upper middle class masses in Montgomery. The Montgomery Improvement Association then said, we have to have a spokesperson. We have to have somebody who is educated, somebody who is an outsider, somebody who's young. King was 25 at the time. And we have to have a centralized location where we can meet because there is no Twitter, there is no social media, thank God, a better day, right? There is not rapid communication. Many of these boycott participants don't even own telephones. So we have to have a place where we can gather every night and have part pep rally, part community bulletin board, part planning session, Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. So, hey, because he was new to the area, King was reluctant to insert himself in this local campaign, right? The bus boycott was so successful that the buses that day were empty. People stayed off the bus. The slogan of the campaign was walk with dignity rather than ride in shame. They decided, the Montgomery Improvement Association decided to keep it going for a year. In the meantime, and it's very early in the movement, is when King is approached by the Montgomery Improvement Association and asked for permission to use his church. It's a great story because King tells it and other E.D. Nixon tells it. And the whole story is King goes back and forth for about 30 minutes. When he finally decides, yes, we can meet at my church tonight, E.D. Nixon says, good, because everybody's going to be here in 15 minutes. So, and it's King provides the local movement with a philosophy, okay? The philosophy is non-violent direct action protest. King is the right person at the right place at the right time. He was a theologian working on his doctorate from Boston University. He was familiar with the teachings of Mohandas Gandhi and Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson and Reinhard Niebuhr, a German theologian who was killed by the Nazis during World War II. And King could take all of these things, put them together, and articulate it in a way that was unique, that resonated with all people of all social classes. Look, it's worth pointing out, too, that Dr. King was kind of a prodigy when it came to the ministry. His father was one of the most well-known, well-respected ministers in all of Atlanta. He was, of course, was later referred to as Daddy King. When you call Daddy King, it was Dr. King's dad, who was the minister at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. So King Martin was brought up in this atmosphere, and he is the person to articulate what the movement is about. He is the person that is the individual that media comes to when word of this boycott, as it goes from one week into a next, from 1 month into a next, from one season into a next, It's Martin that the national press come to for sound bites on what's happening, not just in Montgomery, but in the South as a whole. The interesting thing about the movement is that, yes, it took common people walking for an entire year, but it also took a court case against the owners of the bus lines to finally make it to the Supreme Court. And in December of 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that segregated seating on interstate commerce was unconstitutional. The Montgomery bus boycott succeeded after a year because of grassroots campaigns and because of legal action against unjust segregation law. We've established a template, right? In the aftermath of Montgomery, King starts an organization that was really meant to apply the successes of Montgomery throughout the South, right? It was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. And of all the organizations in the movement that I think students should understand, it's not just the NAACP. The NAACP is really important. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People fight the legal campaign in the courtroom against segregation. SCLC fights grassroots campaigns on the ground, unites communities, direct action protests. It took both. It took top down and bottom up, right? As time passes, the movement begins to accelerate. We see it accelerate in Little Rock, Arkansas. Again, one of the images that's a primary source, and it's one of the most haunting images of the movement. Hazel Bryant yelling at Elizabeth Eckford. See, the Little Rock Nine were a group of 9 students that the Little Rock NAACP said, we want to test Brown. The first major test of Brown v. Board came in Little Rock, Arkansas. And the governor, to prevent their registration, called in the Arkansas National Guard to keep them from registering. Now the president had a choice to make. Do I let states pick and choose which laws they follow, which court cases that they acknowledge, or do we assert our authority? In part due to this image. And I asked tongue in cheek, what happens when it came to enforcement? What happens when it comes to enforcement is that even though the Arkansas National Guard was called out to keep these students from registering, the President of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower, called in the 101st Airborne Division to ensure that they get in. For the rest of the year in Little Rock, Arkansas, at Central High School, these students had a military escort. The federal government, and a reluctant ally, by the way, because Dwight Eisenhower said that he personally opposed Brown, but the federal government, when forced, used the power of the military to enforce school integration. That's a change. That's a change. And you can see the pendulum is starting to swing. As Dr. King later said, the moral arc of the universe is long, but in the end it bends toward justice. And that's what we begin to see, historically speaking. February 1st, 1960, the student phase of the movement begins. And this is another topic that resonates with high school students, because the Greensboro Four are 4 African-American college students who, on their own accord, through no involvement with an organization, ask themselves questions that our students ask. And that is, what can we do here and now to bring about change, to become part of this campaign? And what these 4 young men did was take a little from the Montgomery bus boycott, take a little bit from other campaigns. They were all inspired by Emmett Till. To a person, they all said that Emmett Till was what they didn't want to end up as, they decided that they would stand up simply by remaining seated. See, the place where in Greensboro, North Carolina, where the reminder of their second-class citizenship was often reasserted, was in the dining counters, which were attached to chain variety stores, kind of like the Walmart of their day, Five and Dimes, Woolworths, Crest, Sears and Roebuck, right? So you could buy goods at these stores. If you were white, black, green, red, yellow, it didn't matter. But in the South, you couldn't enter the lunch counter to eat. Oh, you could buy your food. You could buy a meal, but you had to get it at the back door or a side window, and you had to find a segregated park where you could eat it. These four determined that they would simply protest the unjustness by asking for a cup of coffee, and when refused service, even though they had paid for it in the shopping area, that they would not obey the law. The first night, the manager panicked, closed the lunch counters. The next day they came back. They were arrested for trespassing. The next day, dozens of students from North Carolina A&T showed up, and a movement was born. By the end of May, national headquarters had determined that they would no longer at Woolworths segregate by race. And the sit-in movement spreads throughout the South like wildfire. Young people across the South protest injustice by not obeying the law. You see, and this is pretty incredible, but by the end of the summer of 1960, approximately 3,000 Southern cities experienced some sort of direct action protest, whether it's a sit-in in a local cafe, whether it's a swim-in at a local pool, a read-in at a segregated library, a play-in at a segregated park. This is the masses of people whose names will never be in the history books, who are demanding that the American promise extends to them too. And so it continues. Whether it's lunch counters, or it's the Freedom Rides with buses that are literally firebombed outside of Anniston, Alabama. Or higher education with the University of Mississippi, my alma mater. I know the accent fooled you, right? Yes, I went to Ole Miss. You can still see the bullet holes in the column of the Lyceum from October 30th, 1962, when another unlikely president, John F. Kennedy, sends federal marshals to Mississippi to ensure that James Meredith is admitted. Kennedy, an ally, unlikely ally, which gives King hope. Look, laws are beginning to be challenged, and laws are beginning to crumble under the weight of the Constitution. But what if the federal government would pass a Civil Rights Act? What if, instead of fighting a case-by-case guerrilla war against segregation, what if a democratically elected president of the Democratic Party signed a bill that in one signature would end segregation by law throughout the region? That becomes SCLC's strategy. You kind of see with all of these events lining up, and oh, by the way, we're only scratching the tip of the iceberg. This is the purpose of the Birmingham campaign. May 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama, local people, again, local people, invite the national SCLC to come in and helped mobilize local people for a campaign to integrate the entire city. Lunch counters, schools, downtown parks. Young people get involved. Peaceful, nonviolent, except for the Birmingham Police Department. This was a photograph, again, that had international ramifications. This picture, according to John F. Kennedy, made him physically sick. And it embodied what was going on in Birmingham. Now, in the meantime, SCLC is pushing Kennedy not for state troopers or not for federal marshals, not for anything other than you can end this with a federal civil rights act. And it's as a result of Birmingham and the use of police dogs and fire hoses that John F. Kennedy promises a civil rights act, reversing the laws that Plessy unleashed. Okay, so again, the narrative here is, what is the civil rights movement about? Confronting unjust laws that are discriminatorily applied. With the promise of the Civil Rights Act, King, as a representative of SCLC, and 5 other civil rights organizations organized the largest civil rights demonstration in American history. It was the August 28th March on Washington movement. Now, the March on Washington movement was, I say that it's part of it's part demonstration, part church service, part pep rally, but it was all meant to demonstrate to President Kennedy that you would not lose political support from Southern Democrats if you signed this law, because that's what Kennedy most feared. King and these organizations wanted to demonstrate that there was political benefit in passing a Civil Rights Act, that places that had never voted Democrat before would now come to the Democratic Party. It was a huge risk because if few people show up, then it actually sends the opposite message. However, at least 200,000 people appeared. In a day that was celebratory, the keynote was given to Dr. King. And the keynote, the final speaker was Dr. King, because he was the architect of the Birmingham campaign, right? The reason that we're here. Oh, and just to reinforce that this is not just a somber occasion, the person who was on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial before Dr. King spoke was Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan performed at the March on Washington movement. So Dr. King gave the famous speech where at the end he launched into Southern Baptist preacher mode, right? The I Have a Dream part was rehearsed. He had done it several times before in several other venues, but I challenge people, particularly teachers. When the I Have a Dream speech is introduced into your curriculum, I challenge you to show students the first part of the speech. We forget that it is a commentary on a nation who has written a promissory note to its citizens that has been marked returned insufficient funds. It's a pretty dark speech. But at the end, he says, because of the Civil Rights Act, it doesn't have to be like that. Because I have a dream. It's looking toward the future, not the present. The present is dark and the past is even worse. So just keep that in mind when we get to Black History Month and the I Have a Dream speeches everywhere. Kennedy did in fact deliver the Civil Rights Bill to Congress, but he was assassinated John F. Kennedy pledged, I'm sorry, not John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. It was Lyndon Johnson that pledged that he would continue as a mark of John F. Kennedy's importance. It was a politically strategic decision, but that Lyndon Johnson would use the Civil Rights Act as one of the pillars of his Great Society program. Remember, Lyndon Johnson wanted to out FDR. FDR was his political idol. He wanted to be known as the greatest president in American history. And the way that he thought he would do it was by winning a quote unquote war on poverty in this country. So Lyndon Johnson supported the Civil Rights Act and did everything in his power to ensure that it would make it through Congress. And it was no sure thing. In fact, in a campaign that's often left out of the master narrative, right here in St. Augustine, Florida, once again, we see that local people mobilize for their rights. They invite SCLC in 1964. And SCLC actually came to St. Augustine to stop the local movement. You see, the Civil Rights Bill in the spring of '64 was going through Congress, and there was extreme opposition by Southern Democrats to the passage of the bill. In St. Augustine, there was nightly violence. King was afraid that the violence that he saw in St. Augustine would validate all of the opposition to the passage of this act. He was afraid that Southern politicians would say, see what's going on in St. Augustine? We can't pass this bill. It'll produce anarchy. But the opposite occurred. During efforts to integrate a local swimming pool at a motel in St. Augustine, 4 African Americans, at the invitation of a white guest, entered the pool, and the owner poured this muriatic acid into the pool in an attempt to get them out. This photograph was on the front page of Washington newspapers the next day, June 18th, 1964. Because guess what? June 18th, 1964 was the day that Congress voted to accept the Civil Rights Act into law. And senators have said that this photograph was something that many of them were discussing as why the Civil Rights Act had to pass. So local circumstances had national importance. On July 2nd, 1964, Lyndon Johnson signed the most far-reaching piece of civil rights legislation this country has ever produced into law. July 2nd, 1964, the Civil Rights Act is signed. I tell students that the Civil Rights Act is still relevant to every American citizen, every person in this classroom who's a citizen, even people who aren't citizens. The Civil Rights Act doesn't just say Jim Crow's dead. It does that. I mean, I often say that the Civil Rights Act drives a stake into the heart of Jim Crow, but it also prohibits discrimination for any reason, including, but not limited to, age, sex, national origin, religious beliefs, or lack thereof. It establishes a Fair Employment Practices Committee to ensure that not only are we not discriminating in places of public accommodation, but that we are not hiring based on discriminatory practices. The Civil Rights Act, then, is a monumental piece of what it means to be an American citizen. because the civil rights movement should matter to all of us if we love this country the way some claim that they do. It is the realization of the American promises for all citizens, regardless of color, and other things. But it reversed the discriminatory laws that flooded the country in the aftermath of Plessy. And that ends racism, right? Yay! Racism's over. The Civil Rights Act's law, and we all live happily ever after. Oh, but no. Because there's a third part to this series. And the third part is going to examine what next. See, I've set it up thus far, and I think the narrative sets up quite well in that this is a struggle against discriminatory laws, and then the laws are changed. The Civil Rights Act, the passage of the Civil Rights Act in '64 is the high watermark of the movement. Okay, but that doesn't mean the movement's over. The Civil Rights Act had its limits, and there are some things, some issues, some ideologies that the Civil Rights Act never can totally eradicate. So, you know, if the importance here for your students is something that is really important for you to keep in mind, because I always, you know, like I say, I in my conversation, I like to say, does this answer the so what question, right? If you had to answer the so what question from your students, how would you do that? Well, I will say, number one, that the civil rights movement is both a top-down, but more importantly, it's a bottom-up campaign. We don't have legislation. We don't have activism. We don't have national organizations unless we have local people who demand better of their government. The second thing is, along those same lines, King is an important figure within the civil rights movement. He is an indispensable spokesperson, but he is not the movement. He doesn't descend from heaven and declare injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, right? The movement made King. King didn't make the movement. The other thing that I think is important to share with students is that the civil rights movement is a campaign that ordinary citizens participate in to demand that the country fulfill its promise to all people equally, regardless of their race, gender, or even today, gendered identity. In other words, guys, the civil rights movement is more relevant now than it has been since the end of the 1960s. But we have obstacles, we have challenges. Laws don't end racism. And it was King himself who came to that realization after 1964. And that's where we'll pick up when we meet again on Monday. How's that for a cliffhanger, Dave?
Wow. And like perfectly timed too, like all of it. Wonderful.
Well, thank you so much. The challenge that y'all gave me was the civil rights movement in an hour. And I still feel like I left so much on the cutting room floor, but hopefully I gave you some ideas to use in your classrooms. And, you know, for anyone who has any questions, I will definitely hang out and answer those. So I'll turn it back over to Dave Johnson. Thank you once again. I'm looking forward to the final installment of our trilogy.
Well, again, Dr. Butler, applause. We thank you for sharing your time with us. And yeah, I think we all look forward to coming back for the third session here in just a little bit. So
see, everybody's calling you and saying, we can't wait, Dave. We can't wait for this third session, right? That's what that was.
It's my mom. I just muted it, but no, well, if you guys have some questions for Dr. Butler, we'll gladly take them. Otherwise, we'll see you back here on Monday. Thanks, everybody.